nestled between the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, along with parts of the surrounding areas to the north and south, lies some of the most contested real estate of the modern era. This region, sacred to three of the world's major religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, today comprises the political entities of Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, parts of western Jordan, and southwestern Syria. However, the borders of these modern countries are relatively recent constructs. Throughout recorded history, the boundaries of the small kingdoms and statelets that once occupied this area have continually shifted, as have the peoples who once inhabited them. In antiquity, this land was known as Canaan, and its ancient inhabitants as Canaanites. Although Canaan and its people are mentioned numerous times in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, most people have heard or read little beyond these references. Fortunately, substantial archaeological and textual evidence from across the Middle East now allows us to construct a clearer picture of ancient Canaan and its diverse population throughout its history. So, who were the Canaanites? How did they live? And what did they believe? What do we know about their culture and history? In this program, we'll take a look at this and more. Before we proceed, it's important to clarify the terms Canaan and Canaanite. Canaan refers to the region along the Levantine coast, encompassing present-day Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and parts of Jordan and Syria. A Canaanite was an inhabitant of this region. Despite sharing many cultural and linguistic traits, the people of this region were highly diverse. Among the well-known groups identified throughout antiquity were the Amorites, Moabites, Ammonites, Israelites, Philistines, Edomites, Phoenicians, and others. Collectively, these groups are considered to be part of a broader ancient Canaanite civilization due to their shared cultural heritage and homeland. The earliest known reference to Canaan and Canaanites is believed to come from Akkadian language texts dating to around 1800 BC from the ancient city of Mari. These texts mention the term Ki na anu in Akkadian cuneiform, referring to troublemakers in a town called Rahisum. A similar term was also found on tablets from the archives of the nearby ancient city of Ebla, though it can't be confirmed if this also is a reference to Canaan and its people. While we could go back tens of thousands of years, for our purposes here, we'll begin our story during one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Neolithic or Agricultural Revolution. This era marked the shift from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settled agricultural communities. Although this transition occurred independently in various parts of the world, Canaan and the surrounding areas of the Fertile Crescent are believed by most scholars to be the first place where this phenomenon began around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The land that was once Canaan is home to some of the world's oldest continuously inhabited settlements, with Jericho being the most famous. Archaeological evidence indicates that Jericho has been occupied for over 11,000 years, making it one of the earliest known human settlements. The site has revealed numerous layers of occupation spanning various historical periods, including the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. Throughout its long history, Jericho has been strategically located near key trade routes linking Egypt and Africa to Western Asia, Mesopotamia, ancient Iran, and beyond. During the early Bronze Age, around 3300 BC, the first walled towns began to appear across the Canaanite countryside. These towns were typically small, housing about 2,000 inhabitants, though larger settlements may have contained 3,000 to 5,000 people. The walls were generally constructed from large stones or mud bricks. One of the best preserved sites from this period is Tel Arad, where the town's defensive wall featured semicircular bastions at regular intervals. As time progressed, fortifications in these towns grew more complex, and by around 2000 BC, some towns were even encircled by double or triple lines of defensive walls. Unfortunately, the absence of written records makes it difficult to determine the political landscape of early Bronze Age Canaan. However, it is believed that the region was composed of many independent city-states, each controlling the surrounding land and nearby villages. These city-states may have been governed by a chieftain, a council of elders, or a king. The existence of defensive city walls suggests conflict between Canaanite city-states and possibly attacks from outsiders. Due to its location, Canaan was heavily influenced by the cultures of both Egypt to the west and Mesopotamia to the east. During the Middle Bronze Age, roughly from 1950 to 1500 BC, Canaan often fell under the dominance of various powers. In the south, Egyptian influence was strong, while the central and northern regions were more closely connected with kingdoms like Yamhad, and later, the Hurrian kingdom of the Mitanni. While the Egyptians and regional powers of Western Asia sought control over Canaan's lucrative trade routes, many Canaanites sought refuge in Egypt, drawn by greater economic opportunities. A now famous mural on the tomb wall of an Egyptian nobleman at Beni Hassan, dating to around 1900 BC, clearly depicts people of Canaanite origin being presented to an Egyptian court. Further evidence of their presence in Egypt comes from discoveries in the Nile Delta region, where settlements, such as the city of Avaris, have unmistakably Canaanite features, as indicated by the architectural style of many of the buildings, pottery shards, and other artifacts that have been uncovered there. The reasons for Canaanite migration to Egypt varied. Some arrived with trading caravans and eventually settled in the Delta region, or the more populated parts of the Nile Valley. Others came as laborers, drawn by abundant farming and construction jobs, especially during the Middle Kingdom. Some served as mercenaries or bodyguards, manning border fortresses or serving in the household guard of wealthy Egyptians. And finally, after numerous armed conflicts with the Egyptians, where they ended up on the losing side, many Canaanites were brought to Egypt as slaves. Today, Egyptologists recognize that Egypt's 15th dynasty, whose rulers are referred to as Asiatics in later Egyptian texts, and also known as the Hyksos, were of Canaanite origin. During this period, many prosperous Canaanite cities and ports flourished, including the coastal cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, which developed close trade relationships with Egypt and were especially known for exporting high-quality cedar wood, cloth, and wine. Other notable cities included Hatzor, Megiddo, Beth Shean, Dor, and Ashkelon. It's believed that the population of Canaan at this time may have reached close to 150,000 people, most of whom lived on the coastal plains along the eastern Mediterranean Sea, the Jezreel Valley, or the upper Jordan Valley. The Canaanite peoples adopted many new technologies and innovations from their neighbors, particularly with regard to warfare, including the composite bow, chariots, battering rams, and siege towers. However, they were also highly innovative. Canaanite scribes, who were proficient in their local languages, as well as in Akkadian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, used this knowledge to maintain records of exchanges with their region's many trading partners. To manage the large volume of trade data, along with the need for quick record-keeping, around 1600 BC, Canaanite scribes developed a simpler writing system by combining common signs from these two major scripts, thereby creating the first alphabet. This early alphabet facilitated communication among diverse groups speaking different languages, and today stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements. The Late Bronze Age, between 1550 and 1150 BC, was perhaps the most pivotal period in Canaan's ancient history, largely due to the ambitions of its neighbors. To the north, in central Anatolia, was the land of Hatti, ruled by the Hittites. To the northeast, in northern Mesopotamia, was the Hurrian Federation known as the Kingdom of the Mitanni. However, the greatest influence, and indeed domination, over Canaan came from the budding empire to its southwest, Egypt. Around 1550 BC, Pharaoh Ethmos of Egypt's 18th dynasty expelled the last Hyksos ruler from Egypt and launched a ruthless campaign of conquest, ultimately leading to his descendants ruling nearly all of Canaan. The motivation for this was clear. According to Egyptian documents, the Hyksos had invaded Egypt from Canaan. To prevent other Canaanite groups or regional powers like the Mitanni and Hittites from doing the same, it became a matter of security for the pharaohs to control this region. At the very least, Canaan would serve as a buffer between Egypt and the potentially hostile forces to the east. Controlling this region would also give Egypt full access to all the resources and lucrative trade routes found within Canaan. Between 1550 and 1450 BC, city after city in Canaan and the western Levant fell to the Egyptians. Several 18th dynasty pharaohs, including Thutmose I, campaigned in the region, pushing as far as the Euphrates River. Although this was more of a raid than a conquest, its intent was clear: to signal to the Mitanni that Canaan was now within Egypt's sphere of influence. In the mid-15th century BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III focused on the full conquest of Canaan. His most famous military campaign was also his first in the region, which culminated in the Battle of Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley, where he faced a coalition of rebellious Canaanite states and their allies, led by the king of Kadesh. After a 7-month siege, Megiddo surrendered, paving the way for the conquest of all Canaan. The capture of Megiddo was only the beginning. Thutmose III led another 16 campaigns into the region, extending Egyptian influence beyond the Euphrates River and deep into Mitanni territory near the city of Carchemish. For the first time in its recorded history, the politically fragmented land of Canaan was largely united, though under foreign rule. Wars between Egypt and the Mitanni continued until the reign of Thutmose IV, who ruled from 1400 to 1390 BC. During this time, a formal peace and treaty of friendship were established. The peace between these two great powers brought much-needed stability to Canaan, at least from the Egyptian perspective, as it allowed them to collect taxes and extract resources at will. Archaeological evidence indicates that many Canaanite settlements were abandoned during this period, and that the population declined significantly, possibly to as few as 70,000 people. This decline may have been due to the migration of many Canaanites to Egypt for work, as the kingdom on the Nile reached its zenith under Pharaoh Amenhotep III. On average, there were about 15 to 20 major Canaanite cities under Egyptian control between the years 1500 to 1200 BC. Each city was governed by a Canaanite mayor who answered directly to the pharaoh. Though often locally born, most mayors were raised and educated at the Egyptian court, making them well-versed in Egyptian customs and fostering greater loyalty to the crown. Canaanite mayors generally served the pharaoh and his government in three main ways. First, they were required to provide the Egyptian army with troops when needed, a standard duty for all Near Eastern vassals. They were also responsible for collecting taxes on behalf of the Egyptian king, typically paid in grain, olive oil, wine, and other foodstuffs. Additionally, mayors often supplemented these with silver, glass, precious stones, copper, timber, incense, and other luxury items that passed through their territories via merchant caravans. And finally, Canaanite mayors were expected to provide hospitality to any Egyptian dignitaries, generals, officers, soldiers, tax collectors, or other personnel sent by the pharaoh. This included sheltering and providing them with food. Though the Canaanite mayor had his own local militia, it was often not enough, and requests for more Egyptian troops were common. During the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, significant political instability seems to have affected much of Canaan, particularly in the north around Byblos and the border region of Amurru. This information comes from a series of 60 letters dictated by Rib-Hadda, the mayor of Byblos, who frequently complained to the pharaoh about threats to his city and the lack of resources to address them. These letters are part of the collection of international correspondence known as the Amarna letters. The apparent lack of response from the pharaoh and other officials suggests either disinterest in the region or an inability to take meaningful action. A section of one such letter reads, "Speak to the king, my lord, the sun god, the message of Rib-Hadda, your servant. At the feet of my lord, the sun god, 7 times and 7 times I have fallen. May the lady of the city of Byblos grant strength to the king, my lord. Now, thus I write to the king, my lord, but he does not heed my words. Now, for 2 years I have been robbed of my grain. There is no grain for us to eat. What shall I say to my yeoman farmers? Their sons and their daughters, the furnishings of their houses are gone as payment in the land of Yarimuta to sustain their lives. Furthermore, may the king, my lord, heed the words of his loyal servant, and may he send grain in the hold of ships, that he may sustain his servant and his city, and may he give 400 troops and 30 pairs of horses, just as he gave Surata, and may they protect the city for you." Rib-Hadda never got the troops he asked for. In general, Canaanite mayors were distrustful and hostile toward one another, as evidenced by numerous instances in the Amarna letters. From the perspective of the Egyptian government, this may have been the preferred situation, as it prevented Canaanite leaders from uniting to rebel against the increasingly unpopular Egyptian presence in Canaan. Egyptian troops only intervened when conflicts escalated beyond control. However, more formidable threats soon emerged. By the mid-14th century BC, the Hurrian kingdom of the Mitanni had collapsed under pressure from Assyria to the east, and, more significantly for Canaan, the Hittite Empire to the north. Egypt's apparent neglect of its most distant Asian territories, as well as Hittite military incursions, eventually brought parts of northern Canaan and the Levant into alliances with Hatti. With the end of the 18th dynasty, a new line of rulers, which Egyptologists identify today as the 19th dynasty, came to power. By this time, Egypt was fully engaged in war with the Hittites. The Egyptians would occasionally regain territory along their northern border, only to lose it again in subsequent years. Although there were brief periods of calm, the conflict showed no signs of abating. In the spring of 1274 BC, rumors spread that King Muwatalli II of the Hittite Empire was personally leading a campaign to the Canaanite city of Kadesh, with the aim of pushing further south into Canaan. Egypt's pharaoh at the time, Ramesses II, had little choice but to act. If the Hittite king was personally leading his army into Canaan, then Ramesses had to do the same. The battle that would soon follow was one of the most famous of the Bronze Age, the Battle of Kadesh. In May of 1274 BC, Ramesses II and his army marched into what was effectively a trap set by Muwatalli. Although Ramesses II's numerous inscriptions later claim a decisive victory, most historians conclude that the famous Battle of Kadesh was, at best, a stalemate between the two regional powers, if not a disaster for the Egyptians. The Egyptians never reached the walls of Kadesh, lost half their army, and faced rebellions throughout their territories in Canaan. Although these revolts were ruthlessly suppressed, they never regained the territories in Canaan that they'd lost to Muwatalli. Though the Hittites may have fared better overall, a dynastic struggle within the royal family, along with renewed pressure on his western border with Assyria, prompted the later Hittite king, Hattusili III, to ultimately sue for peace with Ramesses in 1259 BC. Once again, the end of hostilities between the two regional superpowers vying for influence in Canaan did not necessarily bring peace for the Canaanites themselves. In 1213 BC, Ramesses II died and was succeeded by his son, Merenta, whose name can also be read as Merneptah. A stela of his records how he faced opposition from the Canaanite districts of Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam. Known today as the Israel stela, part of its inscription reads, "Canaan is seized by every evil. Ashkelon is carried off, and Gezer is seized. Yanoam is made as that which never existed. Israel is wasted without seed. Kor is made widow of Egypt. All the lands are at peace." This inscription is the first known mention in any monument or text of a people called Israel. The archaeological record seems to confirm such conflicts, and the disruptions and destruction that they wrought upon the Canaanite people and their land. Overall, the area under Egyptian rule became impoverished due to heavy taxation and the intentional destruction of many towns and villages. The exception were the larger urban centers, particularly along the Canaanite coast, where increased security came from a stronger Egyptian military presence and the wealth generated by maritime trade. Large quantities of Egyptian luxury items, such as ivory and glazed vessels, entered Canaan, while Canaanite wine, bronze tools, and textiles made their way into Egypt. Such luxuries, though, were reserved for high-ranking Egyptian officials and local elites, who at the time may have made up only 5% of the population. The other 95%, or the common people, were largely excluded from the limited prosperity that the region experienced. There were generally two classes of Canaanite commoners: artisans and farmers. The artisans were skilled laborers who created various crafts, including pottery, textiles, metal, and wooden objects. The second, and by far largest class of commoners, were the farmers, who were more like serfs and required to work the land on behalf of the aristocracy. They survived on whatever they produced and were required to give any surplus to the landowners, i.e., the Canaanite and Egyptian elites. Two other groups living on the fringes of Canaanite society are also worth mentioning: the Shasu and the Apiru. The Shasu, whose name roughly translates to foot wanderers, were shepherds. Early Egyptian New Kingdom texts mentioned them as being troublemakers and living throughout Canaan, from the northern areas of the empire in what's now southwestern Syria to the Negev desert in southern Israel. The other term, Apiru, was any person, regardless of ethnicity, who lived on the outskirts of society. In most Egyptian documents, it seems to have been a rather derogatory term given to unskilled laborers who had come to a given place as refugees and worked jobs that no one else wanted to do. In some of the Amarna letters, the term was used to label criminals and outlaws. For example, The mayor of a Canaanite city would sometimes accuse one of his rivals of conspiring with Apiru. Another excerpt of a letter from Ribhada reads, "Speak to Aman Appa, my father, the message of Ribhada, your son. At the feet of my father I have fallen. I have repeatedly said to you, are you not able to rescue me from the hand of Abdi Ashurta? All of the Apiru men are with him, and as for the city rulers, no sooner do they hear something, but they write to him. So thus he is strong." There are some scholars who believe that there's a possible connection between Apiru, as mentioned in Egyptian documents, and the Hebrew word Ibri, which literally means Hebrew, and might be a possible reference to the early Israelites. However, Apiru had become a common term in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, and without further evidence beyond the similarity in sound, any connection between the two is difficult to prove. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and Aegean world was completely upended, leading to the cataclysmic end to the Age of International Relations that had flourished for over 2 centuries. This gradual breakdown of the old world order is commonly known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Since this episode focuses on Canaan, we won't explore the events and causes of the Late Bronze Age collapse in detail. That said, it's important to note that scholars still disagree on the exact causes, though it was likely due to a combination of factors, including widespread drought, famine, and economic instability, which may have triggered civil unrest, large-scale migrations, and ultimately, warfare. What is clear is that by 1100 BC, societies in the Eastern Mediterranean, Aegean, and the Greater Near East had undergone significant transformations. One group consistently blamed throughout history, and often considered a primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse, are the Sea Peoples. Comprising several groups from different parts of the Mediterranean, their origins remain unclear. Some of them may have come from the Aegean and Greece, others parts of Anatolia. There's also evidence that many may have ventured east from what are today the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. Likely fleeing chaos in their own homelands, the Sea Peoples ventured en masse into the territories controlled by both the Hittite and Egyptian empires, including Canaan. Our main sources on the Sea Peoples come from texts and inscriptions dating to the end of the Late Bronze Age. For example, a letter from the once prosperous city of Ugarit, destroyed around 1185 BC, warns of impending sea-based attacks. Later inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu document attacks on Egypt and Canaan by 9 different groups that made up the Sea Peoples. While the Egyptians managed to repel the Sea Peoples from Egypt, they were less successful in Canaan, ultimately losing the territory and emerging as a significantly weaker state, both militarily and economically. Despite this, Egypt fared better than most. Other states, such as the Hittite Empire, were completely wiped off the map. After the battles ended and the dust settled, several groups of Sea Peoples are believed to have established themselves in Canaan, further contributing to its growing ethnic and cultural diversity. The most famous of these were the Peliset, who are mentioned in Ramesses III's Medinet Habu inscription. Most scholars today believe that the Peliset were the ancestors of the people later known as the Philistines, who settled in the coastal area of the southern Levant during the early Iron Age. Based largely on pottery found in the region, many archaeologists believe the Peliset originated from somewhere in the Aegean. The Philistines eventually settled in 5 primary cities: Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Collectively, they're known as the Philistine Pentapolis. Despite the political upheaval and the influx of new populations, Canaanite culture, language, and religion continued to thrive, with many of their ethnic identities and tribal affiliations remaining intact. The collapse of the Hittite Empire and Egypt's retreat from Asia created a power vacuum in Canaan, which local Canaanite peoples began to fill by reasserting their autonomy and control. The Bronze Age Canaanite tribal groups, who had inhabited the region for centuries, emerged in the Iron Age as localized kingdoms. These included the Phoenicians in cities such as Tyre, Byblos, and Sidon, as well as the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and the Israelites. Local textual sources and archaeological evidence from the southern Levant provide valuable insights into the development and expansion of these groups as they grew to fill the void left by the Late Bronze Age collapse. By 950 BC, the Canaanite languages of the southern Levant had evolved into a diverse array of local dialects and writing systems, often supported by royal patronage. Unlike the Canaanite mayors of the Middle Bronze Age, who, in the Akkadian language Amarna letters, groveled before their Egyptian overlord, these new local rulers asserted their independence and power by proclaiming their own achievements and legitimacy over their kingdoms in their native tongues. For example, in one of the Amarna letters, the mayor of Ashkelon addresses the pharaoh in the following way: "To the king, my lord, my God, the sun from the sky, I indeed prostrate myself on the stomach and on the back, at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. I am indeed guarding the place of the king where I am. Whatever the king, my lord, has written me, I have listened to very carefully. Who is the dog that would not obey the orders of the king, his lord, the son of the sun?" Compare this to the proclamation of King Mesha of Moab from the Mesha Stela, whose allegiance is not to the pharaoh or any earthly king, but his patron deity, the god Chemosh. "I am Mesha, the son of Chemosh, the king of Moab, the Dibonite. My father was king over Moab for 30 years, and I was king after my father. And I made this high place for Chemosh in Karcho, because he has delivered me from all kings, and because he has made me look down on all my enemies." We'll examine this passage in more detail shortly. Each Iron Age kingdom in Canaan had its own patron deity. The people of Moab worshipped Chemosh, Edom revered Caus, Ammon honored Milcom, and Israel followed Yahweh. Each community had a covenant with its patron deity, swore loyalty to it, and performed sacrifices or participated in religious rituals and festivals in its honor. In return, the deity was believed to provide protection to the community. Although other deities may have been recognized, they were considered inferior to the national deity. For example, early Israelites may have acknowledged that the Moabites worshipped Chemosh, but they believed their god, Yahweh, was superior, and vice versa. Devotion to the national god or goddess became a symbol of political allegiance and patriotism toward the community, kingdom, or state. Although the deities varied between kingdoms and even tribes, Canaanites shared many common religious practices and styles of worship. Most temples and sanctuaries featured a large, raised altar, often enclosed by a wall and surrounded by standing stones, incense burners, and various cultic items such as figurines, small idols, jewelry, and food offerings. While many towns and cities had large public sanctuaries serving the entire population, or even a whole region, smaller settlements and individual households often had modest worship areas that mirrored these larger structures. For nearly 400 years, the regions of Moab, Edom, Ammon, Phoenicia, and Israel were ruled as contiguous kingdoms across the land of Canaan. Each kingdom developed its own distinct ethnic identity, with a localized religious system, a written language, and a unique material culture. East of the Dead Sea was the Kingdom of Moab, first mentioned in historical records during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II in the Late Bronze Age. His inscriptions detail military campaigns in Moab and Edom between 1290 and 1224 BC. Although these records mention his campaigns, the formation of a Kingdom of Moab may not have occurred until several centuries later. According to scholars of the Hebrew Bible, Moab was conquered in the early 10th century BC by the Israelite king, David. However, about a century later, King Mesha of Moab regained independence from Israel. This is documented in the Mesha Stela, also known as the Moabite Stone. Discovered in Moab's ancient capital, Dibon, and dating to around 830 BC, the stela celebrates Mesha's achievements, including re-establishing Moabite independence with the aid of the kingdom's patron god, Chemosh. Part of its inscription reads, Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land. And his son succeeded him, and he said, I will oppress Moab. In my days did he say so, but I looked down on him and on his house. And Israel has gone to ruin. Yes, it has gone to ruin forever. And Omri had taken possession of the whole land of Medeba, and he lived there in his days, and half the days of his son, 40 years. But Chemosh restored it in my days. Later Assyrian annals record that Moab was conquered during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III between 734 and 732 BC. After the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 612 BC, Moab came under Babylonian control and was later incorporated into the Persian Empire as part of the satrapy or province of Ebir-Nari, whose capital was Damascus. Another prominent Iron Age Canaanite kingdom was Edom, just south of the Dead Sea. The name is derived from a word meaning red, which is likely a reference to the color of the area's sandstone mountains. Archaeologists believe that the Edomites were a semi-nomadic people who likely entered the Negev desert around 1300 BC. They first appear in the written records of Pharaoh Merneptah, who claimed to have granted many Edomites access to the pasture lands of the eastern Nile Delta between 1210 and 1205 BC. The archaeological record offers limited details on Edomite material culture. In the Hebrew Bible, the Edomites are recorded as a subject people under King David of Israel. After the original kingdom of Israel split into two, Edom became part of the kingdom of Judah. However, by 845 BC, Edom gained its independence, only to lose it in the following century to the Assyrians. Assyrian annals provide the names of some Edomite kings. For instance, the 8th century BC records of Tiglath-Pileser III mention Kaush-Malaka of Edom, who, along with Sanipu of Ammon, Salamanu of Moab, Mitinti of Ashkelon, and Jehoaz of Judah paid tribute to Assyria. Another Edomite king, Kaush-Gabri, appears in the 7th century BC annals of the Assyrian kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. A wealthy land, due in part to its copper mines, Edom seems to have thrived under Assyrian rule. However, its fortunes changed during the Neo-Babylonian period, when around 586 BC, the kingdom was completely destroyed. Like Moab, the remnants of Edom were later absorbed into the Persian satrapy of Ebir-Nari. The kingdom of Ammon occupied the region east of the Jordan River and northeast of the Dead Sea, with its chief city, Rabath Ammon, located where the modern Jordanian capital, Amman, now stands. Likely formed by the consolidation of several nearby settlements towards the end of the Late Bronze Age, Ammon reached its peak between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, as evidenced by the remnants of Rabbath Ammon's great acropolis and lower city. Much of what we know about Ammon comes from the textual sources of its neighbors. It's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as both an enemy and subject of the Kingdom of Israel, though archaeological evidence for this is almost non-existent. Assyrian records from the 9th century BC provide us with more information, including the names of several Ammonite kings, such as Baasa, who fought alongside a coalition of Levantine states at the Battle of Kakar in 853 BC against the army of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. Although the battle ended in a stalemate, Ammon eventually fell to the Assyrians and remained under their rule until the 6th century BC, when it became a vassal of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. However, when the Babylonians were conquered by Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, Ammon as a political entity ceased to exist and was absorbed into the Persian satrapy of Ebir Nari. The most famous of all kingdoms of ancient Canaan, at least in the Western world, are those of Israel and Judah. There's no shortage of scholarly work, let alone academic debates, on the history of these two iconic kingdoms. For our purposes in this program, we'll simply cover some of the most common and agreed upon points amongst archaeologists and scholars of the Hebrew Bible. The Kingdom of Israel is believed to have been established around 1000 BC. By the second half of the 10th century BC, the archaeological record shows the emergence of large urban centers featuring palatial architecture, extensive fortifications, and multi-chambered gates at sites such as Hatzor and Megiddo. Some scholars link these developments to the rise of the first Israelite monarchy, as described in the biblical narrative, a view that is potentially supported by the mention of the House of David on a stela found at the site of Tel Dan. The Kingdom of Israel was eventually split into two, with Israel in the north, centered around its capital at Samaria, and the Kingdom of Judah in the south, with its capital at Jerusalem. Though the Hebrew Bible describes how this occurred, there's little contemporary or archaeological evidence to substantiate such claims. However, the later history of both kingdoms is much better documented, though in other, mainly Assyrian sources. One of these mentions the reign of King Omri of Israel, who ruled between 885 to 874 BC. His reign is the first for which we have solid evidence of a northern kingdom called Israel. Omri and his descendants ruled during a perilous period in Israel's history, as the kingdom was caught between the two great powers of Egypt to the southwest and the encroaching Assyrian Empire from the east. Omri's successor, Ahab, joined a major anti-Assyrian coalition that fought against Shalmaneser III at the Battle of Kakar in 853 BC. Although temporarily able to maintain independence from Assyria, Israel soon found itself in conflict with its former Aramaean allies. By the 830s BC, Israel was paying tribute to the Assyrians, something that's depicted on the famous black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which shows the Israelite king, Yehu, bowing before the Assyrian emperor. From the end of Yehu's reign in 814 BC to around 740 BC, the Kingdom of Israel experienced varying degrees of autonomy, even though the Assyrians continued to claim dominion over them and the other nearby Canaanite kingdoms. This changed under the heavy-handed rule of the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III, who reigned from 745 to 727 BC and forced both Israel and Judah to swear allegiance and pay tribute to him. After Tiglath-Pileser III's death, his son, Shalmaneser V, took the throne. Both Israel and Judah withheld their tribute from the new king. Such defiance was unacceptable and led to a renewed campaign to reassert Assyrian authority over the kingdoms, which culminated in the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria. The historical sources are unclear as to who delivered the final blow. One source, a Babylonian chronicle, states the following. On the 25th day of the month Tebet, Shalmaneser ascended the throne in Assyria and Akkad. He ravaged Samaria. The 5th year, Shalmaneser died in the month Tebet. For 5 years, Shalmaneser ruled Akkad and Assyria. On the 12th day of the month Tebet, Sargon ascended the throne in Assyria. Shalmaneser V either died or was killed, and his brother, Sargon II, widely believed to have been a usurper, became the new king of Assyria. Sargon claimed credit for delivering the final blow to the Kingdom of Israel, providing detailed accounts in his annals, part of which read, "In the beginning of my reign, when I took my seat on the royal throne and was crowned with a lordly crown, the Samarians, who agreed with another hostile king not to continue their slavery and not to deliver tribute, and who started hostility, I fought with them and completed their defeat. 27,280 people who lived therein with their chariots I carried off as spoil. 50 chariots for my royal bodyguard I mustered from among them, and the rest of them I settled in the midst of Assyria. The city of Samaria I resettled and made it greater than before. People of the lands conquered by my own hand I brought there." And so, the kingdom of Israel came to an end. The kingdom of Judah to the south fared better, at least for a time. By avoiding direct conflict with Assyria, Judah was spared the empire's wrath during the Levantine rebellions of the early 720s BC. However, about 2 decades later, under King Hezekiah, Judah, along with several Phoenician and Philistine cities, rebelled against Sargon II's son, Sennacherib. In 701 BC, Sennacherib personally led a campaign to crush the opposition. Although the Assyrians raided and destroyed several Judean towns and cities, including Lachish, they were unable to capture the capital, Jerusalem. Despite besieging the city for some time, the Assyrians eventually departed and headed back east towards Mesopotamia. Based on information from the Assyrian archives, scholars believe that the retreat was prompted by unrest in Babylonia, a region much closer to home and of greater importance to the empire than a few Canaanite states on its periphery. Eventually, Judah submitted to Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, and was added to the Assyrian network of vassals and tributary states, which, at the time, also included the Canaanite cities and kingdoms of Tyre, Byblos, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ammon, Edom, and Moab. Several decades after the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, in 586 BC, Judah was conquered by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, who destroyed Jerusalem and deported much of its population to Babylonia, marking the beginning of what's known as the Babylonian captivity, or exile, for much of the Israelite population. This exile ended in 539 BC, when the Achaemenid Persian king, Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon and, within a year, allowed those Israelites living in Babylonia to return home if they wished. By then, the land of Canaan had changed considerably, and it would undergo even more transformations in the centuries to come. But that's a story for another time. Like most cities of the Levant, Sidon has a very long history. It all likely started in the 4th millennium BC. During that time, The site that would become Sidon was little more than a fishing village, but its residents produced some fine clay pottery, traces of which, or at least a similar style, have been found throughout parts of southern Lebanon and northern Israel. We first hear mention of the name Sidon, or Sidon as it's called in the ancient Canaanite language, in Akkadian sources from around 2200 BC. These, though, tell us almost nothing about the city other than the fact that it existed. There is evidence of at least correspondence between Sidon and at least the government of the kings of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, since Neo-Sumerian seals have been discovered there. However, it's Sidon's relationship with Egypt that is much better attested to in both textual sources and the archaeological record. Like their Canaanite neighbors in Byblos and Tyre, the Sidonians, as the residents of Sidon are called, were a seafaring people who interacted and traded with the various inhabitants of the eastern Mediterranean world, including the Egyptians. While the relationship between the two, at least initially, was primarily a commercial one, during the Late Bronze Age, Sidon was taken over by the pharaohs of Egypt's new kingdom and turned into a vassal state. The city is mentioned several times in the famous Amarna letters of the 14th century BC. In those, Sidon serves as one of the pharaoh's many vassal states, whose leaders are often caught up in the rather petty regional politics of the day. It's not hard to see why the Egyptians and others wanted to control cities such as Sidon. It and its closest neighbors had become the most prosperous cities in the eastern Mediterranean, with all sorts of goods and resources passing through their ports, including silver, timber, olives, precious stones, marble, textiles, and a purplish red dye that would later become popular throughout the Greek-speaking world. Many scholars also believe that the Sidonians may have been the first of the Phoenician cities to have had trade contacts with the Greek-speaking world. Homer even mentions in the Iliad how Prince Paris of Troy brought back elaborately decorated robes from the land of Sidon. The accuracy of Homer's account can't be verified, but archaeological evidence seems to confirm trade contacts between Sidon and the Mycenaean Greek and Aegean world. Regardless, the city was known in antiquity for having some of the best metalsmiths and weavers in the eastern Mediterranean. As Sidon's prosperity grew, so too did its rivalry with nearby Tyre. In letters to the pharaoh, a prince of Tyre, Abi-Milki, constantly accused the rulers of Sidon of treachery against the Egyptian crown. He wrote, "Zimreda, the ruler of the city of Sidon, has written daily to the rebel Aziru, son of Abdi-Ashurtu, concerning every word that he has heard from the land of Egypt. The one who has raided the land of the king is the king of Sidon." Sidon remained a part of Egypt's empire in Canaan until the fateful Late Bronze Age collapse around 1175 BC, which saw the end of Egyptian domination in the region. While most areas of the Levant seem to have succumbed to the roving bands of migrants, collectively dubbed the Sea Peoples by scholars, Phoenician cities such as Sidon and its neighbors, Tyre and Byblos, survived without any destruction. The exact reasons for this aren't known, but one theory is that such cities, which had been wealthy trade hubs for centuries, simply may have paid off the Sea Peoples to leave them alone. With Egypt out of the picture, the wealth and commercial influence of cities such as Sidon attracted the attention of the newest growing power in the region, Assyria. Not even a century after the Late Bronze Age collapse, the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser I, made his way to Sidon around 1100 BC, and, along with nearby Byblos and Arvad, added the city to Assyria's list of tributary states. However, the Assyrian incursion into the area didn't last long, and the Sidonians stopped sending tribute to Assyria shortly after the end of Tiglath-Pileser's reign in 1076 BC. Sidon and the Phoenician city-states came under Assyrian domination for a second time during the reign of the powerful king Ashurnasirpal II between 883 to 859 BC. His annals record large amounts of tribute from Sidon and other Phoenician cities. It was an uneasy relationship, to say the least, and throughout the next century, the Sidonians and others in the Levant constantly rebelled against their Assyrian overlords. Sidon was the focus of a number of military campaigns by later Assyrian kings, including Sennacherib in 704 BC, who reconquered and then replaced Sidon's king. In one of his inscriptions, Sennacherib tells us, "Luli, king of Sidon, who the terror-inspiring glamour of my lordship had overwhelmed, fled far overseas and perished. The awe-inspiring splendor of the weapon of Ashur, my lord, overwhelmed his strong cities, such as Great Sidon and Little Sidon. I installed Ethbaal upon the throne to be their king, and imposed upon him tribute due to me as his overlord to be paid annually without interruption." And yet, the Sidonians would still not submit, and so Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon, decided to put an end to the city's ability to rebel once and for all by not only destroying much of it and beheading its king, Abdi-Milkuti, but also by deporting most of its population to other parts of the Assyrian Empire and replacing them with new settlers from the east. Gradually, what had been destroyed in Sidon was rebuilt, and the city began to prosper once again, especially after the fall of the Assyrian Empire in 610 BC. However, in its ashes came the Neo-Babylonian Empire, whose most powerful king, Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered the city much like Sennacherib had and exiled a portion of its population to Babylonia. The city itself, though, was largely spared since it was useful as one of Babylon's few ports with access to the Mediterranean Sea. In 539 BC, Sidon was absorbed into the empire of the Achaemenid Persian king Cyrus the Great after his conquest of Babylon. Unlike Assyrian and Babylonian rule, the Achaemenids had a rather hands-off approach when it came to running the city. The territory under the city's jurisdiction was also expanded. Some have made the case that Sidon received such preferential treatment because the Persians needed their ships and contacts with the Egyptians for their invasion of Egypt that took place under Cyrus's successor, Cambyses II, in 526 BC. Along with other Phoenician cities, Sidon's navy was instrumental in the Persian king Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480 BC, which ultimately ended in disaster. For the next 137 years, Sidon remained seemingly loyal to the Persian crown, but in 343 BC, all hell broke loose. According to the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, Sidon, along with other cities in the region, rebelled against the Persian king, Artaxerxes III. Though Tyre and Arvad were also involved, and it seems that the Egyptians may have instigated and aided the revolt, it was Sidon's king, Tenes, who acted as the rebellion's ringleader. Though initially he had some success, Tenes grew afraid when he heard that Artaxerxes was sending a force of perhaps 300,000 men, along with 300 ships, to subdue his rebellion. The actual number was probably far less, but whatever it may have been, it was enough for Tenes to write a letter to the great king of Persia with an offer to surrender if his life and the city of Sidon would be spared. Diodorus says that Artaxerxes accepted the offer, but had Tenes killed and Sidon burned anyway. After hearing what had happened in Sidon, Tyre and Arvad surrendered without a fight and resubmitted to Persian rule, under which they remained until 332 BC, when Alexander of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, came to Phoenicia. The historian Arrian writes that the Sidonians surrendered their city to the Macedonian conqueror without a fight. During the Hellenistic era and the wars that followed between Alexander's successors, Sidon was ruled at times by both the Ptolemaic and Seleucid dynasties. Despite the back and forth between which dynasty ruled over the city, Sidon became extremely prosperous during the Hellenistic era and world famous for its glassware. Other important and famous works from this period include the Alexander sarcophagus, the Lycian tomb, and the sarcophagus of the crying women. In 64 BC, the city was brought into the Roman Republic by the great general Pompey, who granted Sidon a considerable degree of autonomy. During the days of the Roman Empire, Sidon reached new heights of prosperity, but by then, its Canaanite, Phoenician identity had all but vanished. Like Sidon and Byblos, Tyre is a Canaanite or Phoenician city. The term Phoenician was used by the Greeks when referring to the Canaanite peoples they interacted with and who primarily lived in cities along the central coast of the eastern Mediterranean Sea. In comparison to Sidon and Byblos, Tyre was established much later, and although some scholars believe there are references to the settlement in tablets from the archives of Ebla dating to about 2700 BC, this hasn't definitively been confirmed. It's actually not until the late Bronze Age, around 1500 BC, that the city appears in texts from Ugarit and Egypt. The ancient political entity that we know of as Tyre was actually made up of two components: the city of Tyre itself, which was on an island just 2 kilometers off the coast of Canaan, and another part on the mainland itself called Usha, which supplied Tyre with food and resources. The Egyptians called Tyre Suru, and during the New Kingdom era, the city was one of Egypt's most important vassal states in the Levant. It was also one of the wealthiest. Tyre appears several times in the well-known collection of diplomatic correspondence known as the Amarna letters. In one such letter, the city's then ruler or prince, Abi-Milki, writes to Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, to inform him of the alleged disloyalty of Egypt's other Canaanite vassals, most notably the ruler of Sidon, Zimreda. We actually briefly met both Abu-Milki and Zimreda in the previous program on Sidon. According to Abi-Milki, Sidon had not only sent men to cut off the city's food and water supply from Usha on the mainland, but also planned to attack Tyre with the help from warlords associated with Abdiasherta and his son, Aziru, the mafia boss or pirate rulers who controlled the relatively lawless land of Amuru to the north. In one of his letters to the pharaoh, Abi-Milki tells him the following: "Furthermore, since the departure of the troops of the king, my lord, from me, the ruler of the city of Sidon does not let me or my men go down to the land to take wood supplies or to take water for drinking. He killed one man, and he took another. 80 shekels, tax for my men, Zimreda, the ruler of the city of Sidon, and the criminal, Aziru, have taken." Though Sidon and the warlords of Amuru proved to be Tyre's great regional rivals, the relationship with Byblos was generally a much more cordial one. In fact, its longtime ruler, Ribhada, was related, at least through marriage, though some also say by blood, to the ruler and prince of Tyre, though whether or not this individual was Abi-Milki can't be confirmed. What we do know from Ribhada's letters to Akhenaten is that things got so bad in Tyre that its people, supposedly instigated by Abdiasherta, murdered their ruler, who was also married to Ribhada's sister. The letter from Ribhada outlining this incident goes as follows: "I made a marriage alliance with the city of Tyre. They were in good relations with me. Behold, they killed their city ruler with my sister and her children. I had sent the daughters of my sister to Tyre,
away from Abdiashirta, and they killed him with my sister and his house. Tyre ended up surviving the political instability of the Amarna period, as well as attacks from Hittite forces that sought to wrestle control of the region from Egypt. The city remained a vassal of Egypt until the end of the events of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Like Sidon and Byblos, the city seems to have remained unharmed during a time when most other major cities in the eastern Mediterranean were being devastated by the roving bands of migrants and marauders that historians conveniently call the Sea Peoples. In fact, after the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, Tyre outshined cities such as Sidon to become the most prosperous and influential of all the Phoenician cities. By 900 BC, it had trading links and colonies on the nearby island of Cyprus, and was sending ships to explore and trade with the peoples of northern Africa, Sicily, southern France, and Spain, just to name a few. In many of these places, the Tyrians set up trading posts, if not full-fledged colonies, the most famous of which was Carthage, today on the coast of Tunisia. Despite Tyre's success and fame, politically, it and other Phoenician cities were subservient to Assyria after the 8th century BC. The Neo-Assyrian kings, though, didn't want to interrupt the lucrative trade that cities such as Tyre engaged in so well, especially since now they benefited from it. And so, as long as the rulers of Tyre accepted Assyrian overlordship and paid the required tribute demanded of them, they were granted a good deal of autonomy relative to other areas under Assyrian control. However, any refusal to meet their tribute obligations or attempts to resist Assyrian authority was met with harsh punishments, including the deportation of the local population elsewhere. For the most part, the Tyrians were too busy making money to join the rebellions of their neighbors, and the tribute that they did offer to the Assyrians was sporadic and not too overbearing. But around 700 BC, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib changed the rules and demanded regular annual tribute, Tyre, along with other Phoenician cities, rebelled in full force. Sennacherib took Usha, but left the island of Tyre alone, since taking it over would have required a significant number of men that were needed to subdue rebellions elsewhere, such as in Lachish and Jerusalem. Still, war was bad for business, and though Tyre could rely somewhat on its overseas colonies and trading posts for support, being cut off from the mainland, especially Usha, substantially hurt the city economically. And so, Tyre's ruler, a king named Baal, made a treaty with Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon. In it, King Baal had to acknowledge that he was Esarhaddon's and Assyria's loyal servant, but in return, he was given control of several ports, including Byblos, Akko, and Dor. Perhaps Baal's dignity was worth more to him than these lands, because eventually he broke his oath of fealty to Esarhaddon and joined forces with Egypt and its Kushite pharaoh, Taharka, to oust the Assyrians from the region. Baal's betrayal was noted by Esarhaddon in an inscription. "In the course of my campaign, I set up fortifications against Baal, the king of Tyre, who trusted his friend Taharka, the king of Cush, and kept answering me with insolence. I cut off the supply of food and water that sustained their lives." But the coalition proved no match for the Assyrian army, and eventually Esarhaddon defeated all of his rivals by not only subduing the Phoenician coast, but also marching into Egypt and conquering it. Another one of his inscriptions states, "I conquered Tyre, which is in the midst of the sea, and took away all of the cities and possessions of Baal, its king, who had trusted in Taharka, king of Cush." Whether or not Esarhaddon actually conquered the island of Tyre is debated, because just a few years later, under Assyria's next king, Ashurbanipal, the city rebelled yet again under the same king, Baal. This time, though, the Assyrians seem to not only have cut off Tyre by land, but blockaded it by sea as well. Baal offered his allegiance to Ashurbanipal and Assyria yet again, and this time it might have been for good. In an inscription, Ashurbanipal tells us his side of the story. In my third campaign, I marched against Baal, king of Tyre, who lives on an island amidst the sea, because he did not heed my royal order, did not listen to my personal commands. I surrounded him with redoubts, seized his communications on sea and land. I thus intercepted and made scarce their food supply, and forced them to submit to my yoke. He brought his own daughter and the daughters of his brothers before me to do menial services. At the same time, he brought his son, Iahi Milki, who had not yet crossed the sea, to greet me as my slave. I had mercy upon him, and returned him the son, the offspring of his loins. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire finally fell around 610 BC, most, if not all of its former territories in the Levant were taken over by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. According to the historian Josephus, Tyre withstood the assaults of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II for 13 years. Eventually, the two sides came to an agreement whereby Tyre would be given some autonomy and be ruled by its own kings in exchange for the Tyrians providing ships for the Babylonian navy. When in 539 BC, the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire's capital of Babylon, Tyre and the other Phoenician cities became part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. For the most part, the people of Tyre remained loyal to the Persian King of Kings. The Tyrian navy also provided ships for nearly all of Persia's campaigns against Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean, the one exception being during the reign of Cambyses II. According to Herodotus, Cambyses wanted to launch a campaign against the Carthaginians, but since Carthage had been founded by settlers from Tyre, the Tyrians refused. According to the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, Tyre was part of a rebellion during the reign of Artaxerxes III, but resolutely stepped back into the Achaemenid fold once Sidon, whose king was the revolt's leader, was brutally suppressed. Tragedy struck Tyre in 332 BC when Alexander of Macedonia came to Phoenicia. The historian Arrian tells us, "Thence he proceeded towards Tyre, and on the way, Tyrian envoys met him, sent by the community to say that Tyre had decided to accept Alexander's orders. However, when Alexander wished to offer a sacrifice to Heracles in Tyre's great temple, he was refused. Insulted and outraged, Alexander vowed to take the city. Since in the past, the island of Tyre had been able to resist invaders such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, Tyre's rulers probably assumed that they could also withstand an assault from Alexander. How very wrong they were. After what was reportedly a 7-month-long blockade and siege, during which he had his men build a causeway from Usha to the island, Alexander finally entered Tyre and killed many of its inhabitants. The 30,000 or so Tyrians who survived were sold into slavery, after which Alexander was finally able to make his sacrifice. Eventually, the city was rebuilt and became an important port during the Seleucid era, but by then, Tyre's Canaanite, Phoenician identity had all but disappeared. The city had been completely Hellenized by the time the Romans annexed it in 64 BC. located about 60 kilometers north of the Lebanese capital of Beirut, what's today the modern-day city of Byblos, was in antiquity one of the oldest and most vibrant commercial ports in the ancient world, and its story is a long one. Due to this, we'll mostly focus on the city's Bronze and early Iron Age history. Little was known about Byblos' early history until serious excavations were undertaken by French archaeologists between 1921 to 1924. The little knowledge of the ancient city that was known came mostly through literary, commercial, and diplomatic texts, including the now famous Amarna letters, which we'll get to a bit later on. In Akkadian and Egyptian texts, the city was called Gubla, while in ancient Hebrew, it was known as Gebal. Its current and most well-known name, Byblos, is derived from the Greek word bublos, meaning papyrus scroll. The French archaeologists who first excavated the most ancient parts of the city determined that the site had been inhabited since at least the 6th millennium BC. It's at these deepest layers that archaeologists discovered the remains of pottery and rudimentary stamp seals. Though interesting discoveries, such objects tell us nothing about the political history of what at the time must have been little more than a small village. The simple life for the settlement's inhabitants, who made their living by fishing and small-scale farming, continued nearly unchanged for the next few millennia, though by 3500 BC, it was clear that they had had at least some contact with the people of the Uruk culture of southern Mesopotamia, as can be seen by the Uruk-style stamp and cylinder seals that have been discovered in and around Byblos. However, it's really around 3000 BC that the settlement that would become the great city of Byblos took shape and began to develop into a trade emporium that connected the Levant with Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and most notably, Egypt. While records for the first two regions are scarce, plenty of references to Byblos, or Gubla as it was called, appear in Egyptian Old Kingdom texts. It's from Byblos that cedar wood was loaded onto ships destined for Egypt. Around 2800 to 2700 BC, large, massive walls were erected around the city with at least two known gates, which scholars call the Sea Gate and the Land Gate. The most important building dating to this period was the temple of the goddess Balat Gebal, aka the Lady of Byblos. Though in ruins today, the temple is believed to have been one of the first monumental structures ever built in the land of ancient Canaan. About 2 centuries later, a second L-shaped temple was built opposite to the temple of Balat Gebal. Both though were destroyed about 600 to 800 years later by Amorite invaders. However, given Byblos' strategic location and commercial importance, the city and its religious institutions were rebuilt by the time of the Mid-Bronze Age, around 1600 BC. The Balat Gebal complex now contained at least 26 obelisks in its courtyard, which scholars are almost certain was due to Egyptian influence. Not only did the lucrative trade with Egypt resume, but new commercial links with Crete's Minoan civilization were also opened up, as can be seen by fragments of Minoan ceramics discovered in and around Byblos. As far as we know, Byblos was politically independent during this time, but after 1550 BC, the city, which for millennia already had commercial ties to the Kingdom of the Nile, became a vassal of the pharaohs of Egypt's New Kingdom. We know a great deal about this period due to many diplomatic and trade texts dating to this time, especially the now famous collection of royal correspondence known as the Amarna letters, in which Byblos and its mayor king, Rib Hada, appear quite often.
Along with Byblos, Ribhada was also in charge of other towns that surrounded his city, most of which were often under attack by men who answered to the warlord, Abdi-Ashurta, or his son, Aziru. Of the over 300 Amarna letters, 60 are attributed to Ribhada, and are mostly addressed to Pharaoh Akhenaten. In these letters, he informs the pharaoh of the malevolent actions of other regional actors against him and his city, along with requesting aid from the Egyptian king to protect Byblos from its many enemies. In one of his letters, Ribhada addresses the pharaoh as follows: "May the lady of the city of Byblos grant strength to the king, my lord. At the feet of my lord, my sun god, 7 times and 7 times have I fallen. May the king know that it is well with the city of Byblos, the loyal handmaiden of the king. But the hostility of the Hapiru troops against me is very fierce. So may the king, my lord, not keep silent concerning the city of Sumur, lest everyone join the Hapiru troops. Very fierce is the hostility against us, so may the king not keep silent concerning his cities." Ribhada wrote many similar letters warning the king of the dangers to his city and requesting troop reinforcements, but to no avail. When he failed to get the attention of the pharaoh, he tried writing directly to Akhenaten's vizier. To Haya, the vizier, the message of Ribhada: "At your feet I have fallen. May Amun, the god of the pharaoh, your lord, give you honor in the presence of the king, your lord. Look, you are a wise man. The king knows this, and because of your wisdom, the king sent you as commissioner. Why have you kept silent and not spoken to the king that he should send regular troops, that they should take the city of Sumur? Who is Abdi-Ashurta, the slave, the dog, that he should take the land of the king for himself?" Unfortunately, Ribhada never got the support from Egypt that he requested, and eventually was forced to flee, or perhaps turned over to the rulers of Sidon by Aziru, the son of Abdi-Ashurta. For the rest of the Bronze Age, and perhaps due in part to a long-standing treaty between Egypt and the Hittite Empire, Byblos was able to prosper under Egyptian rule, at least until the events of the Late Bronze Age collapse. Now, I know we've talked about these events in other programs, including those regarding other Phoenician cities, such as Tyre and Sidon, so I won't go into the details here. But, like Tyre and Sidon, all indications lead to the conclusion that Byblos remained relatively unharmed during a time when most other major cities and the surrounding countryside in the eastern Mediterranean were being devastated by the roving bands of migrants and marauders that historians call the Sea Peoples. Whether Byblos' rulers simply paid off the Sea Peoples to leave them alone hasn't been conclusively proven, but regardless, the city managed to survive, which gave its enterprising population a great advantage when the dust had settled. Byblos soon rocketed into the stratosphere as one of the wealthiest and most important commercial centers in the eastern Mediterranean. Unfortunately, few remains of the city from this period have been uncovered, and so most of our knowledge about what was going on comes from the textual sources of others, most notably Assyrian archives and inscriptions. For example, the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser I, who reigned between 1114 to 1076 BC, reports receiving large amounts of tribute from Byblos' king. The city also appears in the famous Egyptian story known as the Tale of Wen Amun. Though the papyri fragments we have date to about 1000 BC, the events of the story may have taken place a century earlier. In the story, an Egyptian merchant named Wen Amun is sent to the city of Byblos in order to obtain its prized cedar wood, but upon arrival, he's received with scorn. Byblos' king tells him that if he wants to obtain the cedar wood, he'll have to pay some ungodly sum for what in the past had often been a gift for Egypt's temples and pharaohs. When Amun ends up staying in the city for about a year before embarking back to Egypt, but what happens afterward isn't known because the story's conclusion is missing.
Similar to other Canaanite, Phoenician city-states, Byblos fell under Assyrian domination after 870 BC, which was around the time that the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II conquered the city. This, though, didn't sit well with several of the city's kings, who at times resisted their unwanted overlords. Most Assyrian kings, though, who valued wealthy Byblos' contributions to the state treasury, granted its rulers a great deal of autonomy, and for the most part, Assyrian rule provided a period of stability for the city that allowed it to prosper overall. After the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, around 610 BC, Byblos eventually came under Babylonian and then, around 539 BC, Persian rule. There's a famous stela from the Persian period with the depiction of a king of Byblos named Yiha Milk, where he's wearing Persian clothing and receiving blessings from the goddess Malat. Though the Persians ruled over the city for about 200 years, in 332 BC, Byblos submitted without resistance to Alexander of Macedonia, also known as Alexander the Great, and after his death would go on to become part of the Seleucid Empire. By then, though, Byblos' Canaanite, Phoenician character was rapidly being replaced with an increasingly Hellenized one, and by the time the Romans got there, a few centuries later, this unique identity had all but vanished.
So, I hope you enjoyed this program and got to learn a little bit more about the ancient land of Canaan. There's lots more on the way, so be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'd also like to thank the channel's patrons for making videos like this possible. These include, but are certainly not limited to, Grandkick69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Danny Van Eck, Wanix TV, Robert Morgan, Strobex, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Otado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Connor Dolson, Krish, David R, Stephen Ball, Gabe, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Diane Astra, Nimrod Nir, Hypnosan, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.